Well, this past Sunday, the sermon was from Haggai 2, verses 1 through 5. I've also put a link to the sermon in the description. And, Haggai, there at the beginning of chapter 2, is sent once again by the Lord to the people there. The people had returned from exile to deal with this threat of disillusionment and discouragement that is hanging over them. They've been rebuilding now for about a month, and they are beginning to realize that this new temple is not going to be as spectacular as the former. Now, the people who were physically doing the work would not have known of the former temple's grandeur unless they were told about it. Likely they were the younger generation who were born in captivity, born in exile, and then were coming back. Maybe they were infants, possibly, but most of them were probably on the younger side. And they would not have known the grandeur of the temple unless they were told about it, either by their parents or perhaps by others that were older and had seen it with their own eyes. But now, who might these people be? Well, Ezra 3:12 tells us who these people were. It tells there in Ezra 3:12 we read, "But that many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy." So you've got the older generation weeping, and you've got the younger generation shouting for joy. Now, I doubt it was malicious, but it seems like the source of this delusionment was these older men, and they were looking back, they were reminiscing about how much better things used to be when they were children, and how inferior anything that is being done at that present time was to what was done in the past. So they're kind of being a wet blanket. They're sort of being negative and just kind of casting contempt upon the efforts of the younger generation. And again, I don't think it was malicious, but it likely discouraged them and discouraged those engaged in the rebuilding effort who were likely much younger. And of course, it left them with, if that's the case, it left them with a sense that their efforts were being wasted, that whatever they were doing wasn't going to amount to much of anything. And because this temple that they were building was going to be significantly inferior to the original. Now, the reason I bring all this up, because I want to talk about what it looks like when we look back at the past in the right manner versus looking back at the past in the wrong manner. What happened here in Haggai 2 would be an example, and also in Ezra 3 would be an example of looking back the wrong way. Now, what this does is it compares the past to the present day and almost always views the past as better than it actually was, and the present day as worse than it actually was, or actually is, in their case. Now, it's interesting because Solomon actually warns us about this in Ecclesiastes 7:10, where he says, "Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." But yet, this is what they're doing. This is what Israelites also did, and proved that how unwise it is to do such a thing during their 40 years that they spent in the wilderness, always looking back at the former days in Egypt and reminiscing about how wonderful it was, somehow conveniently forgetting how terrible it was, but remembering the meat pots and remembering how they did not lack for water or food during that time, complaining about their present circumstances and driving Moses crazy and also provoking the Lord to anger. So a similar mindset is brewing here and causing this disillusionment here in Haggai 2. Now to jump ahead to the book of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews actually also addresses this issue of looking back the wrong way and the right way. Those to whom the book was initially written were likely Jewish converts to Christianity, and they were looking back at the good old days, looking back at how much better life was when they were following plain old Judaism. Now that they're following Christ, they're experiencing more persecution. They're experiencing persecution from fellow Jews who had not converted, who were opposed to the gospel, opposed to the message of Christ, and but also facing persecution from Greeks and Romans, from Gentiles, and so forth. And the writer of Hebrews goes to great lengths to explain to them that if they were to go back to plain old Judaism, that they would actually be losing Christ. They would be going backwards. See, Jesus is the reality to which everything the Old Testament in the Old Testament pointed. But also, they will be losing that which is better by far, actually. You see, Jesus is actually better than Moses. He's a better prophet than Moses, better steward of God's house than Moses. He's also Jesus is a better priest than Aaron. He's also a better king than David, and he's also a better human being than Adam or any of us. He's also a better sacrifice than the bulls and goats that were offered at the temple, and guarantees better promises. So the writer of Hebrews says, look, don't look back at the circumstances, but look at the promises that were guaranteed. You have now received the promises, and so what you have now is actually better. But so the writer of Hebrews does encourage his readers, while discouraging them from looking back the wrong way, encourages them to look back the right way. And what is that right way? Well, look at what Hebrews 10 says, or listen. He says in Hebrews 10:32-36, recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Now, so what is the difference between looking back the wrong way and looking back the right way? Well, notice that Hebrews 10 roots their ability to endure hardship in God's promises, God's future promises. He says, you knew that you yourselves had better possessions and an abiding one. In those former days, they were remembered that their best days were ahead of them, not behind them. And so they were looking ahead. And so the right way to look back then is to remember how you looked ahead. It's interesting. The right way to look back is to look back really at the promises, to look back at when we were fixated on the promises and looking ahead, and how it enabled us to run the race, enabled us to live faithfully in light of that day. So that's the difference. So that's the right way to look back. The right way to look back is to look back at when we had our eyes fixed on the reward to come, so that we might be reminded of it in the present and be enabled to endure hardship for the glory of God. And so that's what Hebrews 11 is about. Hebrews 11 says, hey, look at all these people in the past. How were they able to endure all this hardship? How were they able to deal with all of these struggles? How were they able to do it without losing heart and wanting to just quit? Well, because they remembered the great reward that they had. They remembered that God had given them such glorious promises, and they had the hope of glory, and they that their eyes were fixated on the hope of glory, and that's how they were able to do it. Now, Paul puts it like this in 2 Corinthians 4. He says, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And that's what Haggai 2 is all about here in verses 6-9. It's saying that the best which is currently unseen is yet to come and will come in God's perfect timing. And what does the Lord say through Haggai there in verse 9? He says, the latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts. So that's really the answer to the riddle. How do we look back the right way? We look back at what God has promised. We look back at how God has continually confirmed his promises, and how an orientation towards his promises has enabled the people of God from history, from the past, and sometimes even ourselves, to faithfully endure hardship in the present. And so that's really the answer. The answer to looking back right way is really looking forward. We look forward to the best days, and that's what the gospel promises, is that our best days are indeed ahead of us. Well, may God bless you. Thanks for watching.